It doesn't happen the way you'd expect. There's no explosion, no dramatic confrontation, no final argument that breaks the camel's back. The day an empath chooses peace over people is one of the quietest days of their life. They wake up and something has shifted. The phone rings and they don't answer it. Someone asks for help and they say no without explaining why. They sit in a room alone and instead of feeling the familiar ache of guilt, they feel something they almost don't recognize. Stillness. Real stillness. And it terrifies them, not because it's painful, but because it isn't. Jung worked with patients who arrived at exactly this threshold. People who had spent their entire lives orienting around others, sensing, adjusting, absorbing, fixing, and then one day, without warning, just stopped. Their families panicked. Their partners accused them of being cold. Their friends said they'd changed, and they didn't mean it as a compliment. But Jung saw something in these patients that everyone else missed. He saw that the stopping wasn't a breakdown. It was the first honest thing they'd done in decades. Today I'm going to walk you through what actually happens the day an empath chooses peace over people. What dies in that choice? What's born? Why everyone around them reacts with alarm? And why Jung believed this was the most critical turning point in an empath's psychological life. The moment that separates those who will heal from those who will spend the rest of their lives bleeding out for people who never once asked how they were doing. To understand what happens in that moment of choosing, you need to understand what came before it. Because empaths don't arrive at this threshold casually. They arrive exhausted. They arrive after years, sometimes decades, of a specific pattern that Jung recognized as one of the most destructive cycles in human psychology. The pattern works like this. The empath senses someone's pain. Not intellectually, they feel it in their body, in their chest, in that space behind their ribs that tightens when someone near them is suffering. And the moment they feel it, a mechanism activates. It's automatic, it's involuntary. It says, fix this, absorb this, make this person okay so this feeling in your chest will stop. Most empaths believe this mechanism is compassion. They think they're helping because they care. And they do care, that's real. But Jung would push deeper. He would ask, what are you actually running from when you rush to fix someone else's pain? And the answer, the one empaths spend years avoiding, is that they're running from their own. Jung recognized this pattern as a form of what he would have called shadow avoidance through external focus. The empath's entire identity is built around being the one who helps, who heals, who holds space, who absorbs. And that identity feels noble, it feels spiritual, it feels like purpose. But underneath it is something the empath doesn't want to look at. Underneath the helping is a terror of what happens when they stop. Because if you stop helping, you have to sit with yourself. If you stop absorbing everyone's emotions, you have to feel your own. If you stop being needed, you have to face the possibility that you don't know who you are without someone else's crisis to manage. And that emptiness, that void where a self should be, is what the empath has been running from since childhood. This is what makes the pattern so vicious. The empath isn't just being kind. They're using kindness as a shield against their own unprocessed pain. Every time they rush to save someone, every time they absorb someone's darkness, every time they put someone else's needs above their own, they're avoiding the one relationship that terrifies them most, the relationship with themselves. Jung observed this in patient after patient. The most empathic people in his practice were almost always the most self-abandoned. They could describe someone else's emotional landscape in extraordinary detail, but couldn't tell you what they themselves actually felt. They could sense a stranger's wound from across the room, but had never sat with their own long enough to understand it. Their extraordinary sensitivity to others existed in direct proportion to their blindness about themselves, and everyone around them reinforced the pattern. Because an empath who's constantly available, constantly absorbing, constantly fixing, that person is useful. Families organize around them. Friendships depend on them. Workplaces exploit them. Nobody in the empath's life has any incentive to say, stop giving so much, because everyone's benefiting from the giving. The empath is the only one paying the cost. So the empath keeps going, year after year, relationship after relationship, crisis after crisis that isn't theirs but somehow becomes theirs. And something inside them, something quiet, something they keep pushing down, starts to die. Not dramatically, slowly. The way a plant dies when you water every other plant in the garden but never the one in the corner. You don't notice it wilting until one day you look and it's barely there. That dying thing is the empath's actual self. Their real needs, their genuine desires, their authentic emotional life. All of it sacrificed on the altar of being needed. All of it traded for the temporary relief of making someone else okay while they slowly disintegrate. And then one day, and this is the day I'm talking about, the day everything changes, something inside the empath refuses to keep dying. It doesn't announce itself. There's no revelation, no spiritual awakening, no dramatic moment of clarity. It's more like a bone-deep exhaustion that goes beyond tiredness. The empath wakes up and realizes they cannot do this anymore. Not they shouldn't, not they don't want to. They cannot. The mechanism that used to fire automatically, sense pain, rush to fix, just doesn't engage. They feel someone's distress, and for the first time, something inside them says, "That's not mine to carry." Jung described this moment as the beginning of individuation, the process of becoming a psychologically whole, separate self. And he noted something that surprises people. The moment of choosing peace over people almost never feels empowering. It feels like dying, because in a very real psychological sense, something is dying. The identity the empath built their entire life around, the helper, the healer, the one who holds everything together, that identity is collapsing, and they don't yet know who they are without it. This is where the stillness comes in, that unfamiliar quiet I mentioned at the beginning. When the empath stops rushing toward everyone else's pain, there's a vacuum, a silence where all that frantic helping used to be. And in that silence, the empath meets themselves, sometimes for the first time since childhood. What they find isn't pretty. They find anger they've been suppressing for years, grief they never let themselves feel because they were too busy managing everyone else's grief, resentment toward people they love, which horrifies them because empaths aren't supposed to resent anyone. They find exhaustion so deep it feels geological, like it's embedded in their bones. They find loneliness, not the loneliness of being alone, but the loneliness of having been surrounded by people for years and never once being truly seen. Jung expected this. He knew that the early stages of individuation are brutal precisely because everything you've been avoiding rushes in the moment you stop running. The empath who spent decades focused outward suddenly has nowhere to look but inward, and what's inside has been neglected for so long it looks like a disaster. This is where many empaths retreat. The pain of facing themselves is so intense that they go back to the old pattern. They pick up the phone. They say yes to the person who needs them. They absorb someone's crisis because at least that's familiar. At least when they're fixing someone else, they don't have to feel this, and the cycle restarts. But the empaths who don't retreat, the ones who sit in that devastating stillness and let it do its work, something begins to shift in them that Jung considered one of the most significant psychological transformations a person can undergo. They start to grieve, not for the people they're pulling away from, for themselves, for the child who learned that their value was entirely dependent on being useful to others, for the teenager who suppressed every genuine need because expressing a need meant being selfish, for the adult who spent 20 years in relationships where they gave everything and received almost nothing and called it love because they didn't know love was supposed to go both ways. This grief is enormous. It's the grief of recognizing how much life you missed while you were busy managing everyone else's. The grief of seeing clearly, for the first time, that the people you sacrificed yourself for often didn't even notice what you were giving up. The grief of understanding that your exhaustion wasn't noble. It was self-abandonment dressed in spiritual clothing. Empaths who allowed themselves to grieve fully, without rushing to feel better, without spiritually bypassing the pain, without immediately finding someone else to help so they could avoid the feeling. These empaths eventually reached something on the other side. Not happiness exactly. Something more fundamental than happiness. They reached a kind of ground beneath their feet that had never been there before. A sense of existing that didn't depend on being needed. And this is where the outside world starts to react. Because when an empath begins to choose peace over people, every system they're embedded in destabilizes. The family that relied on them to manage everyone's emotions suddenly has to feel their own feelings. The partner who was used to unlimited emotional labor suddenly has to show up as an equal. The friends who called only when they needed something suddenly encounter someone who's no longer available on demand. And almost universally, these people don't celebrate the empath's growth. They punish it. They call the empath selfish. They accuse them of changing, of being cold, of abandoning people who need them. They deploy guilt with surgical precision because guilt is the one weapon that has always worked on empaths. If you make an empath feel guilty enough, they'll override their own boundaries every time. Jung recognized this reaction as systemic resistance. When one person in a relational system changes, the system pushes back. Not because the change is unhealthy, precisely because it is healthy. A healthy empath is no longer useful to a system that was organized around their self-sacrifice. So the system fights to restore the old arrangement. It uses shame, guilt, obligation, and sometimes outright aggression to pressure the empath back into their role. This is the moment that breaks many empaths. Not the internal work, not the grief, not the stillness. It's the response from the people they love. Hearing your mother call you selfish for setting a boundary, watching your partner withdraw because you stopped managing their emotions, feeling your friends distance themselves because you're no longer the person who drops everything at 2 a.m. That social punishment is what makes choosing peace feel impossible. And what Jung would tell you, what he told his patients, what his entire framework of individuation points toward, is that the people who punish you for getting healthy were never relating to you in the first place. They were relating to your function, to what you provided, to the role you played in their system. And when you stepped out of that role, they didn't lose you, they lost their supply. That's a brutal thing to see. It's one of the most painful recognitions in the empath's journey, because it means that much of what you called love was actually dependency. Much of what you experienced as connection was actually extraction. And the relationships you sacrificed yourself to maintain were never really about you at all. Not all of them. Jung was careful about this. Some relationships are genuine, and those relationships will survive the empath's transformation. The people who actually love you, not your function but you, will be confused by the change. They'll be uncomfortable, but they'll adjust. They'll learn to relate to you as a person rather than a provider. They'll meet you in the new dynamic because they value you, not just what you give. But some relationships won't survive, and the empath has to let them go. Not because those people are evil, not because those relationships were worthless, but because relationships built entirely on one person's self-abandonment cannot survive when that person stops abandoning themselves. The foundation was never real, and when you stop pretending it was, the structure falls. If this is resonating with something you're going through right now, this process of learning to sit with yourself after years of sitting with everyone else, you might find it helpful to work through it with some structure. We put together a guide called True Self-Discovery, with 24 reflection exercises rooted in Jung's work, designed to help you find your own ground when everything around you is shifting. You'll find the link below. But let's keep going, because the next part of this is where the real transformation lives. Here's what Jung observed about empaths who made it through this passage, who endured the grief, survived the social backlash, and continued choosing peace even when every external pressure said to go back to the old pattern. Something remarkable happened to their perception. They started seeing people clearly, not through the fog of their own need to help, not through the distortion of wanting to be needed, just clearly. And what they saw wasn't always comfortable. They saw that some people they'd been pouring into for years had never once asked them a meaningful question. They saw that certain relationships were entirely one-directional, always flowing from the empath outward, never returning. They saw that people they'd considered close friends were actually just people who'd grown comfortable with unlimited access to the empath's energy. This clarity isn't cynicism. Jung would have called it the dissolution of projection. When the empath was operating from their wound, from that compulsive need to help that was really about avoiding themselves, they projected goodness onto people who hadn't earned it. They saw potential instead of pattern. They saw the wounded inner child instead of the adult who was choosing not to grow. They saw what they wanted to see because seeing clearly would have meant walking away, and walking away meant facing themselves. But now, on the other side of that reckoning, the projections fall away, and the empath can finally see people as they are. Not as the empath needs them to be, not as the empath hopes they could become, as they actually are, right now, based on their behavior rather than their potential. This is where the empath's natural perceptive ability, that extraordinary sensitivity to others' psychological states, finally begins to work correctly. Before, it was corrupted by the empath's own wounds. They'd sense someone's pain and get hijacked by their compulsion to fix. They'd perceive someone's manipulation, but override the perception because leaving felt worse than staying. Their sensitivity was working against them because it was tangled up with their own unresolved psychology. Now, with the wound acknowledged and the grief processed, and the old identity allowed to die, that same sensitivity becomes something else entirely. It becomes discernment. The empath still feels everything, still perceives the layers, the subtext, the unspoken emotional landscape of every room they enter. But they're no longer enslaved by what they perceive. They can feel someone's pain without making it their responsibility. They can sense someone's manipulation without needing to stay and fix the person behind it. They can read a room and decide, consciously, deliberately, where to give their energy and where to withhold it. Jung would have called this the conscious use of a natural capacity. The ability was always there. It was always real. But it was being wielded unconsciously, driven by childhood wounds rather than adult wisdom. The transformation isn't developing a new ability. It's reclaiming one that was always yours but was never under your control. And with that reclamation comes something empaths rarely experience: choice. Real, genuine psychological choice about who to be close to, who to help, who to walk away from. Before, the empath's life was reactive. Someone needed them, so they showed up. Someone was in pain, so they absorbed it. Someone crossed a boundary, so they forgave before the boundary was even acknowledged. Everything was driven by the automatic mechanism of sense pain, fix pain, feel temporarily okay. Now there's a pause between the sensing and the response, a space. And in that space lives the empath's actual self, the one that was buried under decades of compulsive caregiving. The self that has preferences, that has limits, that has a right to say no without providing a dissertation on why. That can love someone deeply and still walk away from them if the relationship requires constant self-betrayal. This is what peace actually looks like for an empath. It's not the absence of feeling. It's not numbness or detachment or indifference. It's the presence of self in situations where the self used to disappear. It's staying anchored in your own emotional reality, even when someone else's emotional reality is loud and demanding and pulling at you to abandon yourself again. The stillness I described at the beginning, the one that shows up the day the empath stops performing, it doesn't go away, it deepens. It becomes something the empath can return to. Not a void, not an emptiness, but a home base. A place inside themselves that is theirs alone. That isn't accessible to the people who used to have unlimited entry. That isn't available to every crisis, every need, every person who shows up expecting the empath to carry what they refuse to carry themselves. This internal ground, this sense of being at home in yourself, was the actual goal of individuation. Not perfection, not enlightenment, not transcendence. Just the experience of existing as a whole person who doesn't need to merge with others to feel real. An empath who's reached this place still feels deeply, still perceives everything, still has that extraordinary sensitivity that makes them who they are. But they're no longer drowning in it, they're standing in it. There's a world of difference between those two things. And here's what empaths discover when they finally reach this ground. The love they're capable of actually gets better, not worse, better. Because love that comes from wholeness looks nothing like love that comes from wound. Wounded love says, "I'll give you everything because I'm terrified you'll leave if I don't." Whole love says, "I choose to be here, and I'll stay as long as this is good for both of us, and I'll leave if it stops being that." Wounded love has no bottom. It keeps giving past the point of depletion because giving is how the empath avoids themselves. Whole love has a floor. It says, "This is where I end and you begin, And I'm not crossing that line even if you beg me to, because crossing that line isn't love. It's self-destruction with a generous label. People who knew the empath before often can't adjust to this version. They preferred the version that had no boundaries, the version that was always available, the version that would sacrifice sleep, health, sanity, dreams, peace, all of it, to make someone else comfortable. That version was easier to be around, not because it was healthier, because it asked nothing of anyone. The new version asks things. It asks for reciprocity, for respect, for the basic recognition that the empath is a person with needs, not a resource to be consumed. And that asking, those simple, reasonable requests, feels like an earthquake to people who built their entire relationship with the empath on the assumption that asking would never happen. Jung would have said this is exactly as it should be. Individuation isn't comfortable for the system the individual is leaving behind. The family resists, the partner resists, the friends resist. Because the empath's transformation exposes what the system was actually built on. And what it was built on was one person's willingness to disappear. When that person stops disappearing, everything that depended on their disappearance becomes visible. The dysfunction, the imbalance, the one-sidedness. It was always there. The empath was just too busy absorbing everyone else's experience to see it. Now they see it, and they can't unsee it. And that seeing is what makes going back impossible. This is what choosing peace over people actually means. It doesn't mean abandoning everyone. It doesn't mean becoming heartless or shutting down or living in isolation on a mountain. It means refusing to abandon yourself in order to maintain relationships that require your self-abandonment as the price of entry. It means deciding, maybe for the first time in your entire life, that your inner quiet matters as much as someone else's comfort. That your emotional health is not less important than everyone else's emotional needs. That you are allowed to exist without earning your existence through endless service. The most difficult psychological achievement isn't facing your darkness. It isn't integrating your shadow. It isn't even confronting the unconscious. The most difficult achievement is learning to value yourself enough to stop sacrificing yourself. Because for empaths, for people whose entire identity was built on being the one who gives, self-value feels like the most radical, most terrifying, most transgressive act imaginable. You're not supposed to put yourself first. You're not supposed to say no. You're not supposed to choose your peace over someone's need. Every message you've ever received, from your family, from culture, from the spiritual community, has told you that your sensitivity exists to serve others, that your purpose is to heal, to hold, to carry, that the measure of your worth is how much you can give before you collapse. Jung would tell you that message is a lie. Not a small one, a foundational lie that has organized your entire life around other people's comfort at the expense of your own existence. And the day you see through that lie, the day you sit in the stillness of your own unoccupied life and realize you are allowed to be here, just as yourself, without performing a single act of service to justify your presence, that day is the day you start to live. Not the life others wanted from you, your life. The one that was waiting underneath all that frantic helping, the one you couldn't hear because you were too busy listening to everyone else. That life is quiet at first, uncomfortably quiet. You'll miss the noise of being needed. You'll reach for the phone out of habit. You'll feel the pull to fix someone, to absorb something, to make yourself useful, because useful is the only way you've ever known to feel safe. And when that pull comes, you'll have to choose again, peace or people, yourself or the pattern, the stillness or the noise. And some days you'll choose the noise. Some days the old mechanism will win, and you'll find yourself 3 hours deep in someone else's crisis before you realize what happened. That's okay. Individuation isn't linear. Jung never claimed it was. You don't choose peace once and become permanently transformed. You choose it over and over, in small moments and large ones, until the choosing becomes less effortful and the peace becomes more familiar, and the voice that says you're selfish for having boundaries gets a little quieter each time. The day an empath chooses peace over people isn't actually one day. It's the first day of a practice that lasts the rest of your life. A practice of returning to yourself when every old instinct says to leave. a practice of staying in the stillness when every conditioned response says to fill it with someone else's need. A practice of trusting that you are enough, just you, without the helping, without the healing, without the carrying, to deserve space in your own life. Empaths who reached this place were among the most psychologically powerful people alive, not because they stopped feeling, because they finally had a self that could contain their feeling, not because they stopped caring about people, because they started including themselves in the circle of people they cared about, not because they became hard, because they became whole. And wholeness, in Jung's framework, was always the point. Not goodness, not selflessness, not spiritual performance. Wholeness. Your stillness isn't emptiness. It's the sound of a life that finally belongs to you. It might take some time to recognize it. It might feel foreign. It might scare you, but it's yours. And choosing it over the pattern, over the expectation, over the guilt, might be the first real choice you've ever made. If you're somewhere in the middle of this, choosing and re-choosing, grieving what you're letting go of, learning to sit with yourself after years of sitting with everyone else, we put together something that might help you stay grounded through it. It's called True Self-Discovery, 24 reflection exercises inspired by Jung's work, built for exactly this kind of passage. You'll find the link below, and wherever you are in this process, you're further along than you think.